Okay, so in the last class, we were discussing the organization of the nervous system. Specifically, we were discussing the cortex or the main cortical regions. Right, we just looked at various sensory areas, various motor areas, and between the two, we had this huge prefrontal area where you have regions which are responsible for decision making. We have seen the case of Phineas Gage, where there was damage to prefrontal cortex, and there were very deep personality deficits, and he had problems of decision making and memory and all that. So in the cortical areas, the kind of the broad roadmap that we can give is there are these inputs, the sensory inputs, which come to the senses, the sensory organs, and once they enter, they climb through over a hierarchy, right, and go to these sensory association areas in the posterior parietal cortex, and there they go to enter the prefrontal areas where certain decisions are made. The decision is what to do with the sensory information, what kind of an action do we take, right, and then those decisions are then further communicated to the motor areas, and where the motor commands descend down descending hierarchy, and these commands are expressed in terms of movements of hand, movements of legs, or speech, or eyes, or whatever. So basically, the broad outline for the cortex is sensory inputs going through multiple channels, going to the decision-making areas of the prefrontal, coming out of there, and then descending down the motor hierarchy. So the ascending sensory hierarchy on one side, descending motor hierarchy on the other side. And between the two, you have this broad decision-making module, which is the prefrontal areas. So this whole thing is the cortex. These are all the cortical areas. So now we said the brain has this sheet of cells. The cortex cell covers the entire brain surface, right? And then all the organs or regions inside the brain are then called the subcortical structure because they are all under the cortex, deep inside the brain. Now there are three major regions or modules deep inside the cortex. Now there are actually many, but we'll just in this simplistic picture that we want to show, you have three major areas. So one is cerebellum. CBLM stands for cerebellum. And there is basal ganglia. And there is hippocampus. These are actually huge, very complex systems. And you see, we have shown them as loops. These are the loops. These loops take input from the cortex and return their outputs back to the cortex. That's why they form a loop. So you've just drawn one single line there, but actually there are many complex loops. So, but this whole cartoon picture gives you a map of the brain, the entire mammalian brain. It is the more important areas. There are lots of details, but obviously, this map will serve very effectively. Okay, so we'll talk about these subcortical structures and how they connect to the main cortex in the form of a loop. The main structures we'll define are thalamus, hypothalamus, and both of these thalamus and hypothalamus are jointly called a diencephalon. Encephalon is brain and di is two. It's like a two brain, double brain. And then basal ganglia, hippocampus, and cerebellum. So they are shown in this diagram, right? For example, this is thalamus and this is hypothalamus. Cerebellum is shown in the back, this light ash colored region. And basal ganglia is actually a bunch of nuclei. You know, the term nuclei refers to like a bunch of neurons. This is not the nucleus that is inside the cell. Okay? So unfortunate confusion of terminology, but that's what neuroscience uses. So basal ganglia consists of multiple nuclei. So it's a circuit. Hippocampus also is actually a circuit. There are lots of little masses of neurons deep inside the hippocampus. And the cerebellum is a whole concrete organ, which is at the base of the brain in the back. Okay, so let us talk about these things. First thing, let us talk about thalamus. Now, thalamus is called the gateway to the cortex. So that is when the sensory information comes from outside the world. Like we said last time, it will climb through hierarchy, an ascending hierarchy of sensory pathways. And before it enters the cortex, because all sensory information has to go to the cortex, right? We know that. And we have seen different primary sensory cortical areas for different senses, primary visual, primary somatosensory, primary auditory, and all that. So before it gets there from the external sensory organs, information has to go through some kind of a very important hub, some kind of a junction box, right? And that is thalamus. So therefore, therefore thalamus is called the gateway to the cortex. Everything has to go through this gateway before it goes to the cortex. So it's called a gateway to the cortex. And it does two things: integration, because different sensory streams of information come to the cortex and kind of come to the thalamus. And there are these portals right inside the thalamus, and the sensory information goes through these portals. So there is possible of some kind of a mixture and integration. Okay, and it decide which sensory information should go to which cortical area and all that. And also there is motor integration, because information from, so because once motor function means these are the commands, and this is what the brain does in order to operate on the world, right? So those commands not only come from, I mean, apparently they come from the motor cortex, but motor cortex is also influenced by other parts of the brain, like for example, basal ganglia, cerebellum, and even to some extent hippocampus. So all these fellows influence our motor cortex, which sends a final command, right, to your hands or whatever. And these influences coming from other deeper parts of the brain, they all go through thalamus. Okay, so you see that it's sitting at a very important location. It's a very central location. It's probably the most central location in the brain, right? Where sensory information goes through the thalamus to go to the cortex, and motor influences coming from other deeper parts of the brain, they influence the motor cortex through thalamus. Okay, so that's the one main feature of thalamus. There are different nuclei. So nucleus means a mass of neurons, right? So thalamus looks like this pink egg-like structure that you see in the brain. No, that's the thalamus. So that is the outer surface. But if you go inside, then it looks something like this. Lots of small regions, and it gets input from somewhere and passes output to somewhere else. So, for example, look at this reddish region, right? It says lateral geniculate. So that's a part of thalamus. It's a nucleus inside the thalamus. The input to the lateral geniculates comes from the eyes, the retina, right? And output of lateral geniculate goes to V1, which means primary visual cortex. So this is a typical example of how thalamus routes the sensory information coming to it to specific cortical areas. So similarly, the auditory information or sound information coming from the ears, right, climbs up a bunch of regions, which you have seen in, I think, previous class. It reaches the medial geniculate nucleus, which is also part of thalamus. From there, it is routed to A1, which stands for primary auditory cortex. So like that, it routes and redirects sensory information coming in. This sensory information come to different portals, right, located inside the thalamus, and from there on, it is routed to specific targets. It doesn't go only to cortex; it goes to other areas also. But this is a simple example of what kind of a role thalamus plays. So these are different nuclei inside thalamus, like medial geniculate, tidal geniculate, pulvinar, so on and so forth, dorsomedial nucleus, and so on. Here there are two different kinds of nuclei among these 50 nuclei. And also, by the way, there are two thalami, because since we have two hemispheres, there is one thalamus on either side. So there are two thalami. And therefore, each of them has 50 nuclei. And among these nuclei, there are something called specific nuclei and other kinds of nuclei called non-specific nuclei. So the specific nuclei, they get point-to-point connections from their inputs. And when they send their outputs, which is typically to the cortex, they send point-to-point connections. Whereas non-specific nuclei send diffuse projections to the cortex. So what do they mean? Okay, so this is an example. So if you look at visual information again, because it's an easy example and we'll keep using this as a convenient example for a lot of things. So I'm looking at an object, a visual object, and I form an image on the retina. Then retina sends this image through a bunch of fibers called the optic nerve. First to LGN, and from the LGN is this green region here. From there, it is sent to the cortex. Primary visual cortex is here. So now if I flash instead of showing a complex object, if I just flash a dot of light on the retina, so that maybe you can see here. In the retina, which is the first layer, I just flash a local dot of light. And that dot of light produces a small local activation inside the LGN. Now that small local activation, the small bunch of neurons are activated. Then this local activation in turn produces a small local activation in V1. So that means a small activation of the retina by some small dot of light will produce a small local activation LGN and small local activation V1. So what is happening is the image that you form on retina is kind of preserved intact, and some kind of an image of that is again formed in LGN, and then another image of that is further formed in V1. So the images, so the thing is, this will not happen if a given point in the retina sends out diffuse or widespread projections to the next layer. It sends fairly focal projections to the next layer. Therefore, the image structure is more or less kept intact. It is distorted in a different reason, but here what I mean is if I show you a point, that point will be, the retina will be a point in LGN, point LGN will be a point in V1. Since the connectivity among these regions is such that this kind of a point is preserved, these connections are called point-to-point connections. So some of the thalamic nuclei serve this kind of function. Okay, so there are other thalamic nuclei which don't have this kind of point-to-point connection, but they send diffuse projections. I hope there is a picture. Okay, so they send diffuse projections. So same region will send to lots of cortical areas. So you see that you can think of thalamus as some kind of a hospital reception desk. Right now, when you go to a big hospital, a corporate hospital like Apollo or something, right? Initially you can't just walk up to some cardiologist or neurologist. Right, you have to go to the desk, and then they'll ask you for your patient file if you have anything. Otherwise, you have to register there, and they'll give you a folder. And depending upon your condition and appointment, they'll direct you to some physician or a cardiologist. Right, so this everybody has to go through this front desk, and then from there they are rerouted to a specific division or a department. So similarly, that's the kind of role that thalamus plays. The input coming from senses goes to thalamus first. From there, depending upon what kind of input it is, right, it is routed to different other cortical areas. Okay, so I mean, I think we have already mentioned this before. So if you look at, let's say, vision, okay, it goes through LGN, and from there to V1. Right, if it is sound, it from the cochlea, it goes to a couple of other areas. I forgot those nuclei, and then it goes to MGN, which is medial geniculate nucleus in thalamus, and then to A1. Okay, so these are all that is thalamus. Okay, so this is on the sensory side. On the motor side, what happens is, this is thalamus, and the output goes to, let us say, motor cortex, and input from basal ganglia or cerebellum go to specific parts of thalamus, and from there they go to cortex, right? So you see that both for sensory integration and motor integration, thalamus plays a major role. Okay, so there's one more important function of thalamus. So there are certain theories of thalamus. What does the thalamus do? So again, here I want to mention that like I said right in the beginning of the course, the problem with modern neuroscience, contemporary neuroscience is, for most brain structures, if you ask what does the structure do, you may not have a single coherent answer. You will have like half a dozen theories about what people think that structure does, and all those theories will have a grain of truth in them. But the problem is there is no integrative theory that says why is this structure, suppose thalamus for example, plays a major role in sleep, right? So sleep rhythms are controlled by interaction between thalamus and cortex. Now we have just seen that thalamus is also involved in sensory input and routing integration. It's also involved in motor integration. So why is a structure which is acting like a front desk to the brain, right? Why is it involved in sleep rhythm? You would think that sleep will be a totally different department. So the theory of thalamus, which talks about sensory integration, should also be able to explain theory of able to explain functions of thalamus in sleep generation or generation of sleep rhythms, right? But there is no such theory. So this is a typical problem with most brain structures today. But one of the important theories of thalamus, which was proposed by Crick, right? Francis Crick, who is of the Watson and Crick fame, the double helix person. Crick, by the way, towards the later part of his life and career, he did a lot of work on neuroscience. And one of his contributions in neuroscience, among many, is this what is called the spotlight hypothesis of thalamus. Okay, he's written a very interesting paper in PNA. It's more like a speculative, a perspective paper, where he says like thalamus acts like a spotlight. What does that mean? Okay, let us say this is a image, but imagine there is actually a video. You're looking at a bunch of horses, people doing racing, and all these horses running in. Let us say you are tracking one of these guys because maybe you have betted on one of these horses and you are tracking that horse very intently. Now, so suppose this is that horse. Okay, sorry. So this is that horse and this is your racer. So when you track it, you need to make sure that you track the yellow, the fellow with the yellow shirt and the horse with some kind of a red, whatever that is, right? And maybe the horse is light brown in color or dark brown in color, whatever. So you're tracking it, right? And you're also tracking, how fast it is moving. Is it overtaking its neighboring other horses and whatever? So when you're doing all this, what you're doing is in this small part of the image space where you have your favorite horse, you are observing the color combination. You're tracking the color combination. You're tracking motion, and you're also tracking that in this part of it is a horse, and this part of it is the whatever the guy who runs a horse, right? So the racer. So which means you are separating the horse from the racer, right? That means you are doing some kind of a form analysis, and then you know that this is the horse and this is the racer. That means you are doing object recognition. So you are doing a lot of visual operations on this tiny part of the image. Okay, so to do that, you have to direct your attention to that part of the image, because we'll later see that in the eyes, you might have heard that there are these photoreceptors called rods and cones in the retina, right, which enable you to convert light into electrical or neural signals. Now, these photoreceptors have a high density close to the center of the retina. Far from the center, their density is very low. So therefore, if you want to get a lot of information from a given part of the image, you have to direct your eyes and attend to that part of the image, so that most of the information that you are interested in falls on the center of the retina, which is where there are a lot of photoreceptors. So you have to do so many processes, right? Color processing, motion processing, form processing, object recognition, all that, right? In the small part of the image. So what happens is, although this entire image is going into your eyes and going to the brain, somewhere up there in the brain, it is decided that you will apply most of your processing power, because all this processing costs energy, right? You don't want to process the entire image because it's wasteful. I don't want to know what are the trees behind in the background, what is this pillar behind the background. I'm not interested. I'm very keen to see that my horse wins. I don't care how the trees are, how the climate is. So I need to pay attention and only process that part and ignore everything else around it. So I need to cast some kind of a spotlight on the object that I'm interested in. So there are two ways of directing that kind of attention. One is simply by turning the eyes towards my object of interest. The second kind of attention is more internal. The brain internally generates some kind of a spotlight signal, which is implemented through the machinery of thalamus. And it is that signal which decides which part of the cortex, right, will be processed with further intensity or with more additional intensity. Okay, so that is called a spotlight hypothesis. So you place your spotlight right in certain part over certain part of the image, and apply all your computing machinery, your computing effort on that part of the image, and that's where you find out your color and object and motion and all those things. So that is called the attentional spotlight. And considering the circuitry of thalamus, right? The way everything has to go through thalamus. Because what is the point in having a kind of a front desk where everything goes? You can, so in hospital when you're a front desk, why do you have that kind of front desk? Because some random guy comes and wants to enter into the hospital. The front desk checks there, and then if the guy has no connection to hospital, or he just came to give some, create some trouble, they'll be stopped right there instead of disturbing the departments inside. So similarly, in the attention spotlight also, it decides what information goes up further and what can be blocked off right in the entry point. Okay, so that is the point-to-point projections are the ones which convey sensory input coming from the sensory organs to the cortex. Right. Similarly, there are these diffuse projections inside the thalamus. These send projections to various parts of the lots of regions in the brain, in the cortex. So those connections are more like this is a thalamic region, and from there you have connections going to lots of brain areas. So these are called diffuse projections. Now, one such diffuse projection area, which is not located inside thalamus, but comes from outside, but it acts on thalamus. It influences the diffuse projection systems of thalamus, and that way it indirectly influences, the thalamus. It influences the cortex, right? And that is called the reticular activating system. It is located, deep inside, so it is located right here. So you see that below the brain, you have this structure, this prominent structure, which you can compare with your Adam's apple, right? It looks exactly prominent, structure, and below that you have medulla, and below that you have the spinal cord, right? So within the pons, and so there is this bunch of rather loosely distributed pools of neurons, which form a circuit called the reticular activating system. These neurons send projections upwards to thalamus, and actually more specifically they send projections to the diffuse projection systems of the thalamus, and they in turn, because anyways thalamus sends this extensive projections to the entire cortex, right? So that way these neurons, which are part of the RAS, can have extensive widespread influence over the cortex. Okay, so what are these RAS doing? Something obviously kind of a process of the brain, a function of the brain, which requires widespread changes. What is that? The general state of awareness or consciousness, like arousal. Are you awake? Right. Also wakefulness. There's also many different levels of wakefulness. You're very alert, intensely sensitive. Even if there is a little, I don't know, a pin dropping in your room, you're alert and you respond to that with great alarm. So that means you're in a state of high arousal. Or you can be awake, but you may not be very alert. I mean, maybe you have just gotten up, right, and then you're still trying to figure out, where are you and what is the time and all that. Then your arousal levels are low. Okay, so in the wakefulness system, there are many levels of arousal, right, and you have consciousness and attention. These levels of wakefulness or sleep, right, is controlled by this very generic system called reticular activating system. So its job is to turn on or shut down the cortex. And how does it do? For that, it has to have access to large parts of the cortex. And the best way to have access like that is through the thalamus, because thalamus has that kind of access to the cortex. So this circuit, this system is located inside the pons and mesencephalon. So pons is here, mesencephalon is somewhere up. So the pons is here. Okay, RAS is here, mesencephalon is somewhere up here. So it controls overall activity levels of the cortex. It sends projections upwards via thalamus through the cortex, specifically through the diffuse projection systems or diffuse projection nuclei of the thalamus. It also sends projection downwards towards spinal cord and controls antigravity muscles. What are these antigravity muscles? Can somebody guess from the name? Does it make any sense? Does it ring a bell? Anybody? Okay, so the anti-gravity muscles are the ones which will let you defy gravity. So whenever you are standing, right, or you are holding your neck erect, right, or your body erect, so you are defying gravity, right? So certain muscles have to get activated, must contract to keep your body in that erect position. So if you are lying down flat on the ground, so then the antigravity muscles are not activated. That's why you're not able to sit erect or stand erect. So when you are in a state of sleep, obviously your antigravity muscles are all inactive. That's why you just lie down and So when you are in a state of wakefulness, generally your antigravity muscles start kicking in. They start getting activated, so you can get up and sit up and all that. If you just want to sleep off, then your antigravity muscles become flaccid. Okay, so when you want to switch the body between two states, a wakeful state or a state of sleep, you should not only activate the cortex and shut it down or shut it up or turn it on or whatever. You should also activate the body appropriately, right? Because when the cortex is awake, and not only the cortex, your muscles also should be active and ready to go, right? Because that's the sign of wakefulness. You are supposed to perform actions. The muscles should be ready. Whereas in a state of sleep, you don't want muscles to be activated. You want to sleep, or your muscles will be relaxed when you're sleeping. You have very weird situations. We are talking about problems like somnambulism, where during sleep also the people stand up and start walking around, which is dangerous. But there is such a phenomenon, and in that case, you have a mixture of the two. The brain is in the state of sleep, cortex is in the state of sleep, but muscles are activated, and person is able to walk. Okay, these are pathological conditions, but otherwise, right, the two are pretty much non-overlapping. So by virtue of its control over the diffuse projection nuclei of the thalamus, RA system controls the activation levels of the cortex, and therefore it drives the sleep-wake cycles. Okay, and secondly, so thing is, how does RAs control sleep-wake cycle? Is there anything that controls RAs in turn? Okay, so answer to that is the peripheral sensory signals, right, especially pain signals, can activate the RAs excitatory area. So here there are actually two areas. One is excitatory and another is inhibitory. Okay, so excitatory and inhibitory. If the excitatory area in turn inhibits the inhibitory area. So the excitatory area is activated, it will activate the cortex. The person will be awake, right, and it will activate the antigrav muscles, so you are able to sit erect or stand erect. But if the inhibitory part is activated, then that will in turn inhibit the excitatory part of RAS. Then it will also shut down the cortex. It will also deactivate the antigrav muscle. So these two parts of RAS act some kind of a push-pull influence, right? Exert some kind of push-pull influence on the brain and the body. And that's how you prepare the conditions that are relevant for both, sleeping and wakefulness. So the RAS excitatory area in turn can be influenced by peripheral sensory signals, especially pain signals. So why is it relevant? Because sleep is not completely slow. Okay, so sleep-wake cycles are roughly controlled by these are what are called circadian rhythms. So sleep-wake cycles are examples of circadian rhythms. Okay, so you know what circadian is, right? Circa is approximately or about, right? And dia is day. So these are approximately 1 day long rhythms. So sleep-wake cycles are obviously 1 day long because you tend to sleep once a day, right? Or wake up stay awake once a day. Now these rhythms are predominantly controlled by a part of the brain called suprachiasmatic nucleus or SCN. Okay, so these control the circadian rhythms, and sleep-wake cycles are examples of that. But this is not the only thing that controls sleep-wake rhythms. Because suppose you have an exam the following day, and you're feeling sleepy. That means your SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus, is saying, "Hey, it's time to go to sleep." No, it's making you drowsy and all that. But if you have a lot of stuff to study, then you will force yourself to stay awake, by taking some coffee, tea, or whatever. Or you can just even rub your eyes. If you rub your eyes very strong, right, to the point that it pains. Those pain signals can activate your RIS excitatory area, and that will wake up your cortex and help you stay awake. Okay, so similarly, RIS excitatory area receives feedback from the cortex. So what happens is when you kind of rub your eyes very hard, or even pinch yourself, right? That will activate your corresponding sensory cortical areas. That in turn will send signals to the RAS exudate area. So from cortex, right, back to to the cortex, back to the exudate area. Sorry, right, and that in turn will activate the cortex. So the thing is, there are always ways of. So no system in the brain has absolute power. I mean, that's how brain is designed. There are always these loops and parallel pathways and all that, so that you can always bypass certain pathways and have some kind of a new outcome. Okay, so that is about RAs. And by the way, there's also a kind of a pseudo-scientific thing going on in India. In certain states of India, people are doing what is called RAs activation. So they go to villages and catch hold of this gullible village people and tell them we'll activate your reticular activating system that will give you immense powers, and you can read with your eyes closed and all sorts of things. Okay, very strange things are going on. People have tried to even expose them and kind of educate people, the masses, that all this is a hoax and just some pseudoscience stuff. But anyway, I've heard of these kinds of things. Unfortunately, they use the expression RAs, but that RAs and the RAs of neuroscience have nothing to do with each other. Okay, so I just want to mention that in this context. Now, another very important subcortical structure, which is a very small region, right? It sits right below the thalamus. That is called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a very small structure, and you can see that. So this is the thalamus, this big thing, and hypothalamus is right here, below that. And it lies ventral to thalamus, extensive connections with the thalamus and midbrain, and some cortical areas that receive information from the ANS is autonomic nervous system. And I didn't spend much time on autonomic nervous system because it's slightly outside. I used to cover all that in a different format for this course, but this time I'm not doing it because we don't have many classes this time. So autonomic nervous system is the part of nervous system which controls autonomic functions, where you don't have much conscious control. And obviously in the body, there are many things where you can't have conscious control. You don't want to have conscious control. Take something as simple as breathing. You can consciously control your breathing, right? You can do pranayama and all that stuff. But imagine a life where you have to consciously control your breathing all the time. It will be a nightmare. You can't do anything else, right? So similarly, your control of internal organs, heart and pancreas and gut, all that is done for you. You have no idea how it is done. So that is the job of ANS. Now, hypothalamus is a major interface organ in the body, in the nervous system, in the brain, between the autonomic nervous system, which controls a huge network, which controls internal organs. Right? The hypothalamus is like the captain of that entire ANS, because through hypothalamus, this ANS then interfaces with other parts of the body. Okay, so then hormonal secretion through pituitary gland. Pituitary, so this, might have heard of this endocrine system, the endocrine glands. Pituitary gland is called the master gland, right? And that controls the activity of a bunch of other glands like thyroid and adrenal gland and all that. So again, pituitary gland is again under influence of hypothalamus. Hypothalamus instructs pituitary gland to get activated and release its hormones, and that in turn will activate other endocrine, the glands and all that. So hypothalamus is a very important structure sitting at the very top of the autonomic functions, right, and the endocrine functions in the body. So then it also controls body temperature. Body regulation is through hypothalamus, and emotions, hunger, thirst, right, circadian rhythms. A lot of this automated stuff, right, is controlled by hypothalamus. Another major structure in the basal area, which is a fairly large structure, it's not actually a single nucleus but a whole network of nucleus, is the basal ganglia. It's a very old structure right from the time of vertebrates, right? You will find this structure called basal ganglia. Roughly speaking, so as you know, this is a subcortical structure, right? A subcortical circuit which has several areas. So this whole thing in this picture, this whole thing is okay. So this whole thing is the basal ganglia. Okay, it receives input from the cortex, and information in the basal ganglia goes through a bunch of these pathways, and output goes to thalamus and back to the cortex. So earlier I was drawing this picture, right? That so this is thalamus, and this is motor cortex, and this is basal ganglia, sends input to thalamus, and from there it acts on motor cortex, right? So that's what is happening here. Information from the basal ganglia goes to thalamus, and from there it goes to the cortex. Now, within the basal ganglia, there is a part called substantia nigra, right, which is substantia nigra, pars compacta, which has certain cells which produce a chemical called dopamine. And in a disease condition called Parkinson's disease, these cells die. We don't know for what reason, right? And therefore, because of loss of cells here, the dopamine levels in the brain starts going down, and that gives rise to lots of symptoms, which is what you see in a Parkinson's patient. Okay, so the basal ganglia, although it's a subcortical structure, it has a wide range of functions, right? In fact, if you can group all brain functions into four major domains. You have motor, or you can even add sensory motor. Sensory motor functions, cognitive function, that is your memory and thinking and decision making and all that. Then affective, right? Affective is a more technical term. Emotional is a more loose term. Affective is what they use in neuroscience and psychology kind of thing. Emotions is more general term. Right, then autonomic. Autonomic is what the part of the brain that controls your internal organs of the body. So there's nothing else. Whatever the brain does can be put in these four compartments: sensory motor, cognitive, affective, and autonomic. Now, any damage to basal ganglia can in principle cause problems in all these, or all, or even some. Right? Can even cause all simultaneously. Right? And all these different brain domains of brain function. So within motor, so if there's a problem in basal ganglia, it can show up in your hand movements, in handwriting, your walking, eye movements, and so on and so forth. Or if you have in cognitive domain, it can show in terms of deficits in working memory, right, action selection, decision making, language function. In affective function, it can show you deficits in reward processing. So generally, your emotions are controlled by rewards, right? If you get reward, you'll be happy. If you don't get reward, you'll feel unhappy. Right now, basically has a major role in that kind of a process. So if there's damage there, you'll do very badly in this reward process. Okay, for example, one of the problems of basal ganglia damage is apathy, right? Apathy means not having any interest in anything in life, and everything seems very dull and insipid and meaningless and all that. Basal ganglia damage can cause that kind of a behavior. That's an affective impairment. So similarly, then autonomic function, basal ganglia damage can cause problems in autonomic function, in cardiovascular domain, in gastrointestinal, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the point is it controls everything that brain does. So one of the major disorder, a neurological disorder, which is more specifically called a category or a kind of neurodegenerative disorder, is called Parkinson's disease, and this happens because of damage to substantia nigra, right, SNC. It's called neurodegenerative because it happens because of the loss of cells in SNC. But the problem is, once the loss goes beyond a certain threshold, there is no stopping. They keep on dying, and whatever medication you give, whatever treatments you give, it might slow down a little, but will never stop the disease process. That's why it is called neurodegenerative. Once it begins and goes beyond a point, it doesn't stop. So some of the main symptoms of this disease are what are called the cardinal symptoms, important symptoms. The tremor, rigidity, postural abnormalities, because that's why people walk with a stoop, as you can see in this picture of the patient, PD patient. And then bradykinesia. Brady means slow, and kinesia is movement. So they move slowly. So they not only move slowly, certain PD patients also have what is called bradyphrenia. which means slowness of thinking. Okay, the same, because thinking is basically some kind of internal movement, right? So if the person moves slowly, maybe the movement of thought is also slows down. So they have bradykinesia. And in motor domain alone, they can have, these patients can have many symptoms in the way they move their hands to reach some object, which is called reaching. Then their handwriting, eye movements, speech, posture, all this can be affected. So on the right bottom here, you can see handwriting samples. These people who have written the word Sri Rama Jayam in Tamil. In the upper figure, it is written by a normal person, an elderly person, but normal, no disease. In the bottom figure, the same samples are written by a patient, right? A PD patient about the same age group, only elderly person, but with PD diagnosis. So you see that they write very small letters, okay, and quite shapeless, and very often, as they write a word, towards the later parts of the word, the letter size becomes smaller and smaller, right? This feature of small handwriting is called micrographia, uh, which is something that you notice in PD patients. And in some patients, when they write a word, towards the end of the word, the letter size gets smaller and smaller. That is called progressive micrographia. Okay, we don't know why it is happening. We have proposed some theories in my lab, but we don't really know why it is happening. Right, and that is something that you see very often in PD patients. Now, PD is associated with this very important brain chemical called dopamine. It is often described as brain's pleasure chemical. So this is the chemical that is associated with your experience of happiness or pleasure. So, for example, if you take psychomotor stimulant like alcohol, beer, whatever, and opiates and all that, even food. I mean, we all like food. I like to eat, especially if you eat your favorite food, your ice cream or pizza, whatever. That will give rise to release of dopamine by these important brain areas. One example is SNC, but that's not the only area. There's one more important area called ventral tegmental area, or VTA, which also releases dopamine. This is a dopamine molecular structure, by the way. And I found this interesting cartoon picture where they're showing this as a happy face. But it's funny. So similarly, brain antagonists attenuate the pleasurable experience of the above. That is, you take your favorite food, or your ice cream or whatever. At the same time, you also take a dopamine antagonist, a chemical, which will counteract the effect of dopamine on its target, cells or receptors. Then that will block the action of dopamine, so you don't feel happy anymore. The food, that ice cream or your whatever is that your favorite dish, is not that pleasurable anymore. Okay, and so the dopamine antagonists counteract the effect of dopamine. So lots of examples like that. People have even looked at the shown subjects, right? Pictures of beautiful people, and that will cause release of dopamine in the brain. And in one study, they have also taken couples, actually young lovers, right, where they are still in love, and they they show each other's picture, and they scan the brain activity using an fMRI. And they find that again, dopamine is released, and there are certain brain centers which are closely connected to dopamine. These centers get activated, and you can see that in fMRI. So lots of these studies, they indicate that dopamine acts like a reward signal in the brain. Now, when you have something like a reward signal in the brain, you can do something very important with it, because the fact that there's such a thing in the brain is, you expect something like that, but it's very interesting, right? What can you do with it? Just think about how we learn a lot of things, right? For example, there's a kind of learning called reinforcement learning, which says learning is all about figuring out the correct relationship between stimuli and responses. So for a given stimulus, what should be my correct response? If I get a correct response, I'm going to get a reward. If I give a wrong response, I get a punishment. Now let's take a small example. Let's say there's an animal, it's looking for some food, some prey, and it finds some red thing moving, and let's say this is a squirrel or something. It sees some, I don't know, a rat or something like that, or cat. It sees some moving red thing, and it thinks it's a bug. right, and eats it, and it turns out to be a very nice juicy bug. So next time when it sees the same kind of a red moving thing, it will go ahead and eat it, and it will get reward. So its tendency to go after that red thing will increase with every recurring event of that kind. So stimulus and response connection is strengthened because for that stimulus, that response has given rise to reward, because food is like reward. But imagine what happens if the animal finds out that the red thing is actually a poisonous bug, an animal falls sick. So for that stimulus, if for that response has given rise to punishment. Therefore, next time if it sees that kind of a red thing, red moving thing, it'll run away from it or at least stay away from it. Right? So in this case, what happened? The relationship between stimulus and response is weakened or attenuated. Okay, so stimulus and response, if it is accompanied by reward, the response that the relationship is reinforced or strengthened. And stimulus and response, if it's accompanied by punishment, that connection is attenuated or weakened. So this is how a lot of things are learned even by humans, right, in our day-to-day life. For example, let's see how, let's consider how exams are, conducted, or how do exams work. For a given question, if you get correct, give correct answer, you get a reward of mark. Otherwise, you get punishment. Or this is area I'm even giving negative marking. So that's like punishment. Okay, so when you have something in the brain, which means reward, the other parts of the brain, right, the dopamine is a reward signal in the brain. The other parts of the brain can use that reward signal and perform actions, make decisions, right? What is the right thing to do? What is the wrong thing to do? So that kind of decisions can be made by other parts of the brain by making use of this dopamine signal, because now we know that dopamine represents reward for the brain. And is that really so? Yeah, it seems to be so, because look at how basal ganglia is located in the brain. So this box is basal ganglia with all its, nuclei. It gets input from the sensory cortex actually and the motor cortex. Sensory cortex tells you what is the stimulus. Motor cortex tells you what was the response that you just performed, right? And then the information coming from the SNC, which gives you the dopamine signal, right? Which means the reward. So what is basal ganglia doing? It takes sensory information, motor information, and reward information, and tells back the motor cortex. Actually, it should go specifically to motor cortex. It tells the motor cortex what is the right thing to do. And what do you see in this box? This box combines three information: stimulus, response, and reward. And what does basal ganglia do? It combines stimulus and response information coming from the sensory motor cortex and reward, and then tells this information back to the motor cortex and makes a recommendation. Look, what you have done just now is a good thing. Next time, repeat that action in response to that same stimulus because it gave reward. Otherwise, next time, don't do it, because you just got some punishment. Okay, so that is something about basal ganglia. Now, you can think of the basal ganglia itself as a kind of a memory, but it's more a what is called a procedural memory. It's a memory of doing things, of motor function, right? The knowledge of how. There's different kind of memory, which is what we actually normally call memory, which is a knowledge of what, or knowledge of facts, right? What is the capital of India, right? Who is the Prime Minister of India? What is the capital of France, or whatever it is. So those kinds of piece of facts, that's what we generally call memory, right? And that's called declarative memory. So there are very broad, two important memory categories of memory. One is declarative memory, other is procedural memory. So the basal ganglia is involved in a big way in conducting the procedural memory. Then what about the declarative memory? Which part of the brain controls that? So that is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain which controls your declarative memory. And here again, in declarative memory, there are two broad categories. One is episodic memory and another is semantic memory. In episodic memory, it's a memory of events, the memory of specific moments in time and place. In semantic memory, it's a knowledge of facts. That's what I was telling you, right? In this, what's the capital of India, what's the capital of Tamil Nadu, and things like that. Whereas in episodic memory, it is events, right? What did you eat for breakfast? Right? When did you last go to a movie in a theater? Okay, and things. When did you last talk to your best friend? These are the episodic memories. So hippocampus is located inside the temporal lobe, right? This is the temporal lobe. You see this, right? And it is set deep inside. This picture is not a great picture, but it's set deep inside. There's a long thing. It's called hippocampus, and it is involved not only in memory. It's involved in memory consolidation, and another function is spatial navigation. In memory, what it does is when you receive input from the world, normally in your waking state, the information goes to quickly get stored in hippocampus, but it doesn't sit there forever. After about a day or two, or over a day or two, it will get transferred to longer term memory stores, which are actually distributed all over the cortex. The hippocampus is a small structure, it cannot store much memory. So it just sits there for a day or two and gets transferred to the longer term stores in the cortex. And even this transfer happens in a very mysterious way. There's a huge field that looks at this transfer, and obviously, like many other brain processes, we don't have a final answer, a complete story here. So what happens is in your deep sleep, right, what is called the slow wave sleep, so the information in the hippocampus seems to be pulled up, right, and then it is kind of shipped off to slowly and transmitted to your various cortical areas, and that's where it seems to be encoded during your deep sleep. Now, what does hippocampus do? So to understand the function of hippocampus, we can look at the anatomical connectivity of hippocampus. Hippocampus is located here, so it is located inside this, right inside this temporal lobe like this. Now, like I said, if you just look at the anatomical pictures, it doesn't make any sense. Why a given structure located where it is. But if you look at the connectivity pattern, the logic becomes very clear. So if you look at so here in this picture, the upper block represents parietal, prefrontal, and temporal. Right, parietal has this huge, the sensory association areas. Prefrontal does all this decision-making stuff. Temporal lobe has, this object recognition and auditory function and all that. So from here, you send projections to other cortical areas called the parahippocampal gyrus and perirhinal cortex. From there, it finally goes into entorhinal cortex, and from there, it goes to the hippocampus. So this loop of structure all located inside this region. Okay, so that is the hippocampus. If I don't want to go into all these details, you can roughly represent hippocampus as a cortex, right, huge area, talking to small region called hippocampus. You have projections from cortex to hippocampus, and then there's feedback from hippocampus to cortex. So what is this stuff doing? Let me just give a kind of a cartoon description. Let us say you are looking at a cricket ball. It's red in color, round in shape, and it's hard to feel. All these properties, and maybe even some more, together represent an object or a concept called the cricket ball. So in the cortex, the color is processed in one region, the shape is processed in a different region, and the hardness is processed in yet another region. No, but obviously you experience the ball as one entity, one object with a certain name. So all these cortical areas project, just like in this picture, to hippocampus, and hippocampus integrates all this into some kind of a object concept, right? And puts a label saying cricket ball, and that is a basis for your formation of memory. Because when you memorize, obviously you are not going to memorize the small patches of color and this, like this roundness of shape in itself. You combine all these sensory properties into an object called cricket ball, and that's what you tend to memorize. Okay, so hippocampus, a lot of knowledge of hippocampus has come from the studies of this one of the earliest patients called HM. HM stands for Henry Morieu or something like that. So this patient, he suffered from severe epilepsy. And epilepsy is a phenomenon where the abnormal activity starts on one part of the brain and spreads to the entire brain, right? And under this condition, there's synchronized activity of neural activity all over the brain, and so that will completely incapacitate you, right? And you even become unconscious. So Even now, there is no complete cure for this, like with most other brain disorders. So in this patient, so earlier days, what people used to do is, when epilepsy patients, when it is intractable and doesn't respond to drugs, they just try to isolate what is called the epileptic focus. It is part of the brain where this activity is generated, right? And then just surgically remove it. And typically, the epileptic focus is located inside hippocampus. So they would remove hippocampus and sometimes a neighboring region called amygdala, which is located right here. And that also would be removed. The entire hippocampus, they would remove big parts of temporal lobe. So along with it, hippocampus would just go. So when they did that, initially the epilepsy was controlled to some extent. But unfortunately, the person will have trouble with storing and retrieving memories. So these people, HM definitely, particularly this person HM, they could not remember memories from after the surgery. That is called retarget amnesia. Right, that is, so the surgery is, let's say, happens at this time. And this is now. Okay, so they cannot form memories of what happened after the surgery because the part of the brain which creates memories, that's hippocampus, that's gone. Right, so therefore you're not able to store new information. And you could also, right, and also you cannot form, this is now, so in future you cannot form new memories. That's called anterograde, and right, in future, antero. That is retro, this is retro, and this is antero. Antigravity Muscles. Then the same hippocampus is also involved in spatial navigation, which is very interesting because that's why the hippocampus is also called the GPS of the brain, right? And this is what creates a map of the surrounding world so that you can navigate around in the world around you. So this function of the brain became quite popular after 2014 Nobel Prize because in this year or in 2014, the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology was given to 3 people for their seminal work in the area of hippocampus and spatial navigation. So specifically, John O'Keefe in US, he was given the prize for his work on what are called place cells. That is, these cells are cells which fire whenever the animal is in certain part of the surrounding space. So they're called place cells. There's another kind of cells called grid cells. They were discovered by May-Britt Moser and Edward Moser in Norway. So these cells fire when an animal is not just at one location, but at multiple set of locations. So what is interesting is all these locations form a nice periodic grid, and therefore these cells are called grid cells. So after this Nobel Prize, this area became quite popular. Okay, so then finally we come to cerebellum. Cerebellum is this big structure at the back of the brain, and it integrates 3 kinds of information. The somatosensory information on the spinal cord, because the touch information comes from the skin, and most of the skin is right on the body surface. Not much skin on the face, right, in the head. So the information coming from the body surface below the neck, it's all goes to the spinal cord mostly. And what information from the so all that goes to the cerebellum. What information from the cortex, from the motor cortex, also goes to cerebellum, right? And balance information from the vestibular organs of the inner ear. So inside the ear, you have this thing called semicircular canals, right? Inside which are fluid filled. Therefore, there's rotation of the head, right? Because of inertia, this fluid follows the rotation, but after a delay. And during that part, the fluid flows against or over certain cilia, right? And which will activate certain neurons. And activation of that neurons indicates your head rotation. That is what is used to restore your balance and correct your balance. Okay, so cerebellum has access to all these 3 kinds of information. It does many things. It's called cerebellum means little brain, but it's actually it has widespread influence on a lot of brain functions. It coordinates planning, timing, and patterning of skeletal muscle contraction during movement. It coordinates and synchronizes different threads of movement. Suppose you are doing a very complex dance movement, which involves simultaneous movements of the legs and the hands and the eyes and neck, which is the kinds of things you see in dance, right? You need an intact cerebellum to do something like that. So similarly, maintenance of posture, you need cerebellum. Coordination of head and eye movements, cerebellum. Ballistic movement, that is fast movements, it definitely needs cerebellum, because if there's cerebellar damage, you won't be able to perform fast movements. Okay, so basically what it does, at least the current theory of cerebellum functions like this. This is cerebellum, it receives touch information from the spinal cord, right? And motor. So when you perform a motor command, the motor cortex sends the command to the spinal cord. Like for example, kick the ball, right? That command goes to the leg. Okay, and so that same copy of the command, what's called the efferent copy of the motor command, also is sent to the cerebellum. Now, when you kick the ball, and suppose you haven't kicked the ball hard enough, because ball hasn't gone all the way to the goal, then that command, or okay, let's say I'm just raising my hand. Okay, you suppose raise your hand all the way point so that it becomes vertical. So you send some command to the hand muscles, and it hasn't become vertical. So then that feedback goes to the cerebellum. Then the cerebellum sends correction back to the motor cortex saying, you haven't given a strong enough command to the hand, therefore it is not able to go all the way up. So therefore, intensify your motor command. So that error correction goes to the motor cortex. The motor cortex sends a fresh command. All right, so the loop goes on and on. So that is how cerebellum corrects your motor commands. Right. So this is called a forward model, because the motor cortex cerebellum has to have a notion of where the hand should be if that command is executed. Okay, that's called a forward model. And clinical features, any damaged cerebellum can cause these kinds of symptoms, like dysdiadochokinesia. Dysdiadochokinesia. Okay, it's a kind of a tongue twister. It refers to inability to make quick alternate movements. A good example for us as South Indians is the thalam. In Carnatic music, that the musician puts his hand puts one hand on the other, and right, and keeps flipping the hand right back and forth. That's called thalam, and that kind of a movement involves rapid stop and go kind of movements. And if there's a cerebellar damage, they won't be able to do that. Then dysarthria, which represents an impaired speech production, because speech involves very rapid stopping and stopping of your vocal cords, right? Because of there's a problem. In addition, they have what is called intention tremor. That is when a person who has lost, when they perform a voluntary act, just when they want to act, the movement starts oscillating. You see a kind of a tremor showing up in the hand, right? Especially when the hand approaches the target, the tremor becomes even more amplified. That's called intention tremor. And these people also have nystagmus, refers to erratic movements of the eyes. Okay, in cerebellar nystagmus, there is a tremor of the eyeballs, right? And which again typically happens when you try to fixate on a target. Okay. So next, finally, we have medulla, which is rostral extension of the spinal cord. So rostral and caudal, the two terms. The rostral is, if you look at apply this to the spinal cord, rostral is upwards, caudal is downwards. Caudal means tail, so that's a mnemonic. So medulla is the upward extension of the spinal cord, and it is involved in participating in regulating blood pressure and vasomotor center, so which is located here. It has lots of areas which control our cardiac function, cardiac and vascular function. Okay, they're all very loosely distributed. And then there is pons. Pons is here. It has lots of neurons that relay information from cortex to cerebellum. So cerebellum, you can think of it actually as a whole different brain located below the original brain. So the lot of connections that go from cerebellum to cortex via pons to the cortex. Okay, so these bundles of fibers, what are called pontine peduncles, right? All of them go through pons. So finally, let us summarize. So we have looked at different. We'll actually be looking at more of them later. But brain is organized not just as a bunch of diffuse areas, but lots of systems, right? And so this is a block diagram of the motor system. The premotor and supplementary motor area at the top, then motor cortex below that, and brainstem below that, and finally spinal cord even below that. And then from here you activate your muscles and produce movement. There's a hierarchy. There's the highest level, there's the lowest level. Similarly, if you look at visual system, the retina is the input, the lowest level. LGN is the next higher level. V1 is the next higher level, and so on and so forth. And then at the highest level, you have inferior temporal cortex and the MT, MSC, and so on. So here also there's a hierarchy. So we can see now that brain has many of these sensory pathways. The ascending hierarchy and descending hierarchy is on motor side, right? And so there are 5 governing principles which define the major function systems of the brain. The first one is each function system involves several brain regions that carry out different types of information processing. So take visual system, there are different parts in it where each part does some specific function. V1, memory analysis of the image, MT does motion analysis, and so on. In principle 2, there are identifiable pathways that link components of the functional system. So here we talked about only the components, the regions. In this principle 2, we are talking about the pathways which connect these components in a certain order, which is very important. Like I said before, what pathway indicates the pathway which does which finds out what is the object, and the where pathway finds out where is the object. The third principle says each part of the brain projects in orderly fashion to the next, thereby creating topographical maps. This is what we'll be studying in the next class. What are these brain maps, and how did people study them? The fourth thing is these systems are hierarchically organized. In the sense, there is a notion of lower level and higher level in each of these things. So, for example, in the case of motor system, activation of supplementary motor area produces complex movement. The activation of premotor produces maybe a few muscles or a single joint or something like that. Activation neurons in the primary motor area only activates single muscles or even parts of a muscle. So there's a hierarchy, highest level and lowest level. Then finally, principle 5, function systems on one side of the brain control the other side of the body. So there's some kind of a strange contralaterality of influence in the brain. As left brain controls the right body, or right body sends inputs to the left brain, and vice versa. We don't fully understand why it is like that, but it's a very important feature of the nervous system organization. Okay, so that's a summary. We talked about subcortical systems, thalamus, hypothalamus, basal area, hippocampus, and cerebellum, and we looked at some broad features of the brain's organization. So with that, we are done with the discussion on the nervous system and its organization. From the next couple of classes, we'll look at some general properties of the brain. We'll look at brain maps in the next class. And in the class after, we'll discuss memory function. Okay, so any questions so far?